custom elements are a way for you to design and use HTML elements that don't exist. And what I mean by that is, so I'm sure you're familiar with like div and paragraph and anchor and button and all that stuff, right? So those are all built-in HTML elements. They all have like their own specific behavior. Like, okay, on a button or an anchor, or a div, or whatever, you can do a .click, or you can add an event listener, or all these other sort of features for like interacting with these, with like your document structure. What you haven't been able to do is to be able to create a way of interacting with those elements from the context of an actual, like your own element itself. So what I mean by that is you would have like a function, and your function would, call in disease, would request an element from the browser, like, oh, I want to look at this div, and then from there, it's like, okay, I want to manipulate this div somehow. I want to check that it has the right like children beneath it and stuff like that, has the right properties and attributes on it. But you couldn't really like attach that function to the DOM itself and have it run outside of like things like event listers and stuff like that. So the custom element specification comes in and it's like, okay, now instead of having like a function where you just kind of have this stuff done one-off, or you just add it as an event listener within this like whatever other structure you have, now we're going to make it so that you can actually insert your behavior into the browser and have it accessible from anywhere else, even other script files. And you can still work with the properties and the methods that you define in that context. So I'm going to get into a little bit more about what that I mean by that when we get to the concepts part. The concepts part, I'm going to go over like what is HTML, what is JavaScript, what are classes, what is the DOM, stuff like that. So I'm sure I know Elizabeth. At the very least, you know about all that because you went through the academy. Matthew and Benjamin, I'm not sure how much you know for sure. So I'm just apologize if I'm, if it's like baby steps for you. It's
all right.
Yeah, just want to make sure that because even for people who come in later who are watching this, like to make sure that they have like an understanding of what the terms you're talking about are.
Well, please use the baby steps. I'm fine with that.
I actually attend the classes, so I do have a basic knowledge on HTML.
That's good. I will say, I'll guarantee that the way I describe it probably won't be how you've heard of it before. If it is, then shucks, but that's what it was aiming for. So hopefully it's some nice bite-sized, simple explanations that you can really latch onto. So as I mentioned before, so why would you use these elements? I kind of alluded to this, but you can kind of simplify your code a lot because it's being integrated directly into the browser. So a lot of behavior is, when you see the code's going to be like this very small definition, relatively. Maybe 20 lines, for instance, just to get like a simple example going. But when you actually start to work with it, work with the element itself, what you'll notice is you have all of those other abilities that regular old HTML elements have already. So like you can call .click on it without defining a .click handler or .click event or .click method, I should say. You can add event listeners to it. You can inspect the DOM structure through APIs like the parent element and previous element sibling and things of that nature. You can set the inner text or the inner HTML. You can pull the outer HTML so you can see exactly what the custom HTML's elements HTML markup is, etc. All stuff that's built into the browser for like a regular old div or span, but by virtue of using this custom element feature in the browser, you also get access to that with your code. And there's nothing else that you need to do other than just this little tiny bit where it's like literally like you alter one line and add another line of code, and you can suddenly work with all this other stuff. So it's really easy to get started with and really powerful. And as I mentioned earlier, they're kind of related to React. in the sense that this is drawing on something called the component design pattern. And what the component design pattern, which, as it says here, was popularized by React and then was adopted by Angular and Vue, and I think others like Ember and stuff like that, is that components are essentially saying, okay, for a given thing, we know exactly what we want to do. So like we want to count words in a paragraph or count words in a section of the document. And there's an example of that later where we use that for custom elements. But rather than defining a whole bunch of functions that you just kind of throw at the wall willy-nilly, what the component design pattern says is, okay, we're going to define all of that in a single context. And that can just be like a regular object, or what you need to do for custom elements, it can be something like a class, a JavaScript class, which I'll explain later what a JavaScript class is if you're not familiar. But within that context, which is like an object, so a special object for your code, you can define all the behavior and all the properties and everything that you need for your application or for your website. And you can at that point it's considered encapsulated, which means that you can call it a whole bunch from all over the place and with potentially just a single line of code. And you don't have to worry about wiring everything up all the time, which is something that you saw a lot prior to this, especially with stuff like with AngularJS, in the older kind of MVC style is what it was called, model view controller. Everything was split up all the time, whereas now it's like, okay, now it's taken for granted that everything's going to be a single unit. Like your markup, your JavaScript, your styles, those are all considered a single unit. And that unit can be plugged in anywhere in your code base, and you don't really have to think about how you're plugging it in. You just have to know that it exists and know what it does. That's kind of a little bit about the component design pattern and what the basis for it was. But how it worked was how the timeline goes is that the React came up with this idea for component designs, and then it was adopted, and then eventually the browsers went, hey, we can actually do this ourselves. So we're going to implement we're going to come up with a specification that will basically give these kind of basic capabilities in a way that's like accessible for everyone, where they don't have to learn these big libraries like Angular, and you don't have to include like Webpack or Grunt or Gulp or Rollup or any other sort of build tool. You can just literally just drop some JavaScript into an HTML page and get started, which is the spirit of the web. And that's part of, again, why I'm so excited about it, is because I'm really excited to see what I think these are really powerful concepts, and to see them being made accessible in like this really relatively simple way of doing things, I really am excited about. So that's kind of my introduction. I ended up talking a little bit about some concepts that I'm going to get into next, but are there any questions so far about anything? All right. So, all right, as I said, we're going to start off with some really simple ideas. We're not really going to take any assumptions about what you know, but so the first thing, HTML. It's an acronym. It stands for Hypertext Markup Language, which is just a really kind of fancy way of saying like, here's a text file with some special text in it, and that defines how the browser will actually render, like literally like this hello world right here. This is all you're going to see in a browser when you load it up in that side of H1, but all of this stuff around it is kind of necessary for the browser to know exactly how to render it. What this is kind of the standard way for a programmer or a user to describe the structure of a page to a browser, but it's also the standard way for how a browser tells you how the page is currently, or how it's structured, when it's running. So, like if I were to take this HTML and put it into a HTML file, load it into a browser, and then I open up the browser's developer tools, I will see the exact same HTML or something extremely close to it, maybe with like, some attributes set here and there by default. But I expect that, since there's no JavaScript in this little HTML example, there's nothing actually happening to it. I plop it in there, I look at it again, and in the developer tools, and the browser is going to describe to me exactly what was in my HTML file. But if I were to add in some JavaScript that modified it, then that HTML would change, right? So like later on, when we get to the DOM section, you're gonna see I'm gonna you can see this little append child thing. So I can add another HTML element into it. And when I look in developer tools, the HTML inside the developer tools will be updated to reflect the fact that I've added that element there. And that's the browser taking its internal states and communicating it back to me in HTML. It's generating that HTML for me based on its knowledge of how things are doing. So it's a way for a user to tell a browser what it wants, but it's also a way for a browser to tell a user what's already there, and for a user to verify the behavior that's going on. So JavaScript, and then following on from that, it's the standard programming language for the browser. It used to be the only programming language for the browser, but then stuff like WebAssembly started coming in. WebAssembly, I'm not going to get into that, but essentially it's another way of running programming languages in the browser, but that's outside the scope of what we're talking about here. For all you need to know is that JavaScript is the standard programming language. That's the one that you're 99.999% of the time going to be using until you get into really, really kind of niche scenarios. So JavaScript is what allows you to define custom behavior for a website, period. So for example here, I got an add function and I've got a subtract function, and I've got a little bit, it just returns some basic math operations. And then you can see that I can call those later, and I can pass those to another. This is a built-in function called console.log. And so again, if I can open up the browser developer tools, and I'm going to do that later when we do the examples and stuff. I'll be opening up the browser's tools so you can see what those look like in like Safari. You can pass this behavior. You can use this behavior and call it after you define it, and then use it to perform some sort of calculation, or do some other sort of tasks you consider useful for your website. So Matthew, I saw you kind of shaking your head there for a second. I think you kind of saw the issue with the code example that I had there, but it's
I saw as well.
Yeah.
In the JavaScript.
Yeah, in the JavaScript. So I put a little note here, just so you might have read that already, but just in case like you weren't paying very close attention. Yeah, these are actually named improperly. And I did that on purpose because to prove a point about how you are able to define behavior. It doesn't have to be named accurately or anything like that.
The words add and subtract are not defined to the computer.
Right. They don't mean anything. They're a communication tool for you and for anybody else who has to look at your code. But as far as the browser is concerned, it doesn't give a crap.
If it doesn't turn a different color, like function or console, it doesn't exist to the browser until you tell it it exists.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. The one exception is if you try to do it twice, and it's one of the situations where you can't do it twice.
Yes. Don't tell it means two different things. Browsers don't like that.
If I do another function subtract, it might actually work. I don't remember, but it'll probably fail and say, no, you already have subtract. Get out of here.
I think it depends on what parameters it's asking for, but I think that's not what we're talking about right now.
Well, no, I mean the point is like the names are for you. They're not for the browser. So that's
correct.
Just a little example of that there. So that's HTML and JavaScript. Now, how they are wired together, and I talked about this a little bit when I talked about HTML, but they're wired together over something called the DOM, which is an acronym that stands for the Document Object Model. And essentially that's just how JavaScript is able to interact with and change a website. So you can see here we have the document object that's defined for you by the browser. The document object has a lot of methods on it. So for instance, ones we're using here are query selector and create element. Query selector is one of the ways that a browser allows you to ask for an element on a page, or even within a specific context. With my H1 there, for instance, I can actually do an H1.query selector as well. And that'll come up a little bit later when we get into the examples. But all of those methods there that you see, like query selector or dot parent element, dot intertext, dot create element, those are all available for maybe not create element, but those are all available for pretty much all HTML elements. So these are all specified in a document. There's a living standard, it's called. There's the what working group, they call themselves. They compose the members of all the browsers. They're the ones who actually manage what these functions look like and how they're specified and stuff. So the DOM is essentially the glue between JavaScript and HTML. You can think of it that way. And that's how you're able to do basically anything in the browser. So even if you're using a framework like Angular or React or Vue, if you actually look in the code and you dive down to the lowest levels of where they're doing things, they're still calling document.createElements, document.query selector, and all these different things. There's no way around that. You have to use these APIs if you're developing a library, or even if you're just trying to do a website on your own where you interact with the HTML. So basic standard APIs that you need to know, or functions, methods you need to know to work with a website at kind of the lowest level of what a browser lets you do. So moving on from that, this is kind of the final concept, and this is the class. And this is actually a feature of JavaScript specifically. Just a language feature. It's not something defined by the browser like the DOM. This is built into the language itself. I bring this up because classes are mandated for custom elements, so understanding what they are is important for this. But as far as the definition of them, there's kind of a few different ways you can approach them, like describing them. The one I like to think of it is it's something that you're supposed to call new with. New being the new keyword. And what that means is when you have a class, it's expected that you're not just going to use that class directly. You're going to say, okay, I want a new instance of this class. So I want a new representation of it. So you can see there I have const foo equals new foo. And then I'm console.logging this assignment that I have here, as well as the result of the return of the return value from the result of this method. And then I'm modifying that variable to show that's how it changes. And by the way, you can copy and paste this code directly into a browser, and it'll work. I'll post the repo later after we do I haven't posted the code yet because we haven't done the live example yet. There's going to be a live demo at the end. But once you look at the code, you can actually pull this code directly out of it and just run it in the browser, and it just works. So a class, like I said, something you're supposed to call new with. If you try to call it without calling new, then it's gonna throw an error. It's gonna be like, what the hell are you doing here, bro? I don't like this. But under the hood, and this is actually what they're based on, is functions, right? Regular old functions. So if you look at some old AngularJS code, you're going to see this pattern a lot, where you have this variable assigned to this, and then you have these different things set on here. And the reason why is because you're essentially, before 2015, you didn't have this class keyword. Like, this is a relatively new feature, like in the past 5 years. literally 5 years ago. And so you would have to write code that was kind of like this, or there's an even worse form where you have to do foo.prototype.bar = 1 and foo.prototype.baz and stuff like that, which was strictly speaking more correct, but it's also like you look at it and it's like your brain wants to fall out of your head. So if you look at it from the function perspective, you can do a little bit more than you could with a class, but that might not actually, for all intents and purposes, that might actually be a bad thing for you, because you might actually want this to be newed up and stuff like that. But anyway, so that's kind of a little analogy for what classes are. But then additionally, and this is how you are going to be integrating with HTML elements, you can also extend other classes with classes, and that allows you to share code. So in this example, you can see that we have our class bar, which is extending our foo class from here. And that will, from there, we're going to set this .bar to 2. And then you can see we don't do anything else. We just change what the initial value of bar is. When it calls super, it'll call this constructor and it'll set this .bar to 1. So if we console logged it right here, we would see a 1. And then we can assign it to 2. But then you see down here, what we're going to do, we're going to make a new instance of bar. And we can call bar.bar, obviously we defined it. But we also call bar.baz, which we didn't define. That just came from foo for us for free. Excuse me. And so then we can do the same thing that we did with foo, where we can access and change variables and call methods exactly as we want. But then you can see that we go down to our foo3 here. We have our foo1, or foo and our foo2. So we'll have our foo3. And you can see that when we look at bar and we look at baz, they're still exactly the same as they were how we defined them. So our class bar here, any changes we make here are just kept for bar. They don't affect foo at all. They don't affect, it's called the class and the superclass, or the child class and the parent class. Bar is the child class. That child class doesn't affect the parent class foo at all. It exists in its own world, essentially. But it benefits from anything that foo knows. So foo knows about how to call baz. It knows what bar is initially. So even if we didn't define bar, this .bar inside bar, this constructor, we would still be able to look at that and get a 1 back out of it, because foo was doing that for us. So any questions so far? Kind of went over a lot of material, so if there's something you'd like me to go back over, that's perfectly okay. Something that maybe I didn't explain particularly clearly.
Just really quick. So my experience is more with Java, and therefore classes are not new to me. You're saying that classes are new to HTML, like this is a class that you could build straight into a website, and this is something.
Yes. So I'm gonna pop over here I'll pop over the index just to explain what I mean.
Because I can't. It's hard for me to imagine, because I learned from Java, like programming without classes seems like, why not?
Yeah. No. And well, in Java you have to use a class.
Yeah.
There's literally nothing you can do but classes in that. So. I understand that. So like in HTML or in JavaScript, you don't have a main that you have to worry about. So I can just have here const foo equals 1, and then I can do console.log times 2 or whatever, or foo equals 100, 1000, and I can just run that directly. I don't need anything else. I could even run that. I just copy and paste that into the developer tools, and it's fine. I don't have a entry point that I have to satisfy, or any sort of complex language and semantics, and just get started and go. But what I was referring to about classes versus functions. So literally, say I have class foo. Right, and I have Dot bar equals 1, and then and same as before, where I'm returning dot bar equals this dot bar. So that's the old way, or that's the new way of doing things. But this is actually an enhancement of a pre-existing form, which was the function form, where in here you would say this dot bar is 1, and then return this. Ignore the error. It's detect the editor is detecting that there are two foo's here, but this is just for example. And then you would actually have to do something that foo.prototype.baz equals, and then you would define a function baz that returns.
Oh my gosh.
This dot bar plus this dot bar. And then further, so like now all you have to do is class baz extends foo, and you're done. And then previously, you would have to do function baz, and then you would have to do baz.prototype equals, I think it's something like foo.prototype.
Oh my gosh. So basically, we still have the simple ways of working with it, but now you have the more dedicated class functions and such. Okay.
And there's some differences between these. Minor differences that matter as far as like if you're writing a code translator that takes a class and makes it into a function, if you're trying to run it in like Internet Explorer, for instance, there are certain incompatibilities that come up in that example. But as far as like the intent behind the feature and by and large how it functions, it's those two forms. This is how it was. This is what it was intended to take over from. Was from this, so it's not exactly the same, but it's built on that idea, directly on that idea.
Okay, thank you.
If I were to do baz.prototype, I can do baz.prototype, and I can assert that it's equal to foo.prototype, and I'd be correct or something like that. I think it's baz.prototype triples. It could be triples foo. I don't remember, but. That is still there in the background because of what it's all based on. It's all based on the same stuff. So that's what I was referring to there with that stuff. Joseph, hey, good to see you, Joseph Raka. We're a little ways in now. Is there anything you want to get caught up on before we get into? We're about to get into the examples. So is there any kind of intro stuff you'd like me to cover for you? Just listening in. All right, cool.
Yeah.
So,
And then I want to open it up to the table. Is there anybody that might have any questions for Zach at this point?
I think I asked the main question I needed. Thank you.
There are no silly questions. Trust me.
Absolutely no silly questions whatsoever.
If you've known some of the questions I've asked in the past of people of people that I actually look up to, you'd be like, oh yeah, you're right.
I have a story, but I'm not going to get into that now in this video. I have proven that wrong before.
You cannot make a bigger fool of yourself in front of me than I've made in front of other people. That's my point.
I trust you. Don't worry.
But all right, so it seems like everyone's following along for the most part. So I will continue. So that's the kind of important concepts. That's what we're all what I assume you need to know in order to get into this. So we're going to get into some of the examples now. So I have 3 examples. So the first example is basically just how to define and use a custom element, which is very tiny amount of code. We'll be able to shoot through that really quickly. The life cycles bit. So this is where we're starting to get into some of the features that are specific to custom elements. And so these are like kind of predefined well, the specific term is an interface, but it's like it's methods or functions you have to define on your custom elements that would allow you to hook into a browser events without having to write any sort of custom integration code. You just have to like write the method there. So that'll take a little bit longer because I'll have to go over what each. There's only 4 of them that we really need to know about. Here's a 5th one, but it's not really relevant to, I would say, the majority of use cases for people. But you can look in. I'll mention it. And you can look into it later if you like. And then the advanced one is a ludicrous example of exactly how deep into the rabbit hole you can get, and that's based on an actual example that I pulled from from a web components example repo, like an official repo that's referenced in the Mozilla documentation. So if you know about the MDN, I pulled the example straight from there and just changed it a little bit so it would run in Safari, because Safari has kind of a caveat with this feature. But you know, as what I'm going to show you, everything is going to be runnable in every single browser. So that being said, first example, as you can see, incredibly tiny. This is you can copy and paste this entire thing and into an HTML file and run it. In fact, I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm going to go to my examples directory. And I'm going to open up my basic.html. And I'm going to do a new share here. So we can just see my whole desktop now. All right. Can everyone see both screens just fine?
Yes.
Cool. Or both applications, I should say. So as I mentioned before, you can just run the stuff directly in there in the browser, and then you can look into the developer tools to see how it works out. So the one thing I want to point out here is that I wrote out the custom element example. This is how it would look if you were to write it out. It's just an HTML element, and it's put in there before I define it in the script tag. So you don't need to worry about like ordering your scripts in there and making sure that you can like I have to run my script before it reaches this HTML, otherwise my entire site blows up. You don't have to worry about that. As long as you define the custom element properly, you can use it anywhere in your documents, and the browser will just be able to pick it up for you. So in that case, we're going to go a little bit into what's going on here. So as you can see, we're extending the HTML element using that extend syntax that we worked with. And this HTML element is a built-in interface, built-in class in the browser. It's actually been around forever. One thing is I don't think you can call new on it. Like you can't call new HTML element. You have to call document.create elements and then pass in the tag name it's called. So like a div or span or something like that. But when it comes to custom elements, you extend this built-in object, and that's what gives you all of these different APIs. So I'm inside the constructor here, and I call it super because you have to do that. That's just the rules. And then once I've done that, now I can set the inner text. I can append child to here. And these aren't defined by me. These are defined by the browser. So if I were to pull this H1 element, which if you'll notice back into the concepts, I actually did that right here. So I pulled this H1 element, and now I have H1.innerText. Oh, that's fine, Elizabeth. Thanks for coming by. I appreciate you showing up. Wish you best of luck with your training. So if you pull this, you can pull this HTML, this H1 element, or any other elements, and you can see on here we have access to the parent elements, which is in this example is document.body. You have access to the inner texts, and you have access to all these other things, right? append child, a million other APIs that I can't even begin to remember. That's just all there for you. You know, you can look up the documentation for HTML elements in MDN or anywhere else, and you'll say, okay, this is what .click does. And it's like, okay, now I know what .click is, and you can just call that on your custom element. But then additionally, in addition to that, you can also define your own logic on here. So for instance, in our constructor here, we are adding a span tag, and that span tag, we're setting this inner text on it. So if we inspect this element here, that opens up the developer tools for us. So we can look inside of we can see here's our custom element example, and we can open that up, and we see, oh, here's the I'm a custom element, and then here's the span that we created. And inside that, here's our little how neat text. So we did that, and then now we look over here, and we're gonna look at what the previous element's siblings inner text was, which in this case we can look the previous element to it is this h1. So we're going to get in this case we're going to get the h1 tags inner text. We're going to look at our inner text, which is I'm a custom element, how neat. That's actually slightly wrong. And then we're going to get the secondary text, which is just how neat. And you can see that logged out here. Here's the first one, the first console log right here, second console log, the inner text right here, and then the third console log, the get secondary text. So and that's essentially all you need to know to get started with custom elements, literally. You could stop the video right now, you could stop listening to me and just go out there and start writing this code, and you don't really need to know anything else to move on from there. As long as you can learn like what the DOM APIs are and how to work with them using the documentation, then you know you're already on the road to success. But obviously there's more to learn and more that I would going to present and suggest that you stick around for. But essentially this is all you need to know, is that you need to define it like this, and then on this line right here, we're calling custom elements.define, which is using something called the custom elements registry, which we say, okay, this is what we want our custom element tag to be. So we can see the custom element example here. That's what we define it here. If I change this to just custom element, and then I refresh over here, it doesn't work anymore. But then if I that, now it does, right? So that's how you tell the browser about it, and then you know, you can use it this way, or alternatively, you could also do it a different way where, and you know, I'm gonna there'll be an example of this in the next bit, but where you can go, okay, I'm gonna do, rather than querying it from the document using the tag name, I can say, okay, I'm gonna do a new custom element example. And then, okay, documents dot body. Well, I would write some different code to get it to actually get into the browser. But you can call new on it that way, and then you can work with it that way. So it's like, okay, I'm gonna do example dot click, then this dot on click equals console.log. And onClick is a standard attribute for all elements. It's like, okay, I want to assign a single click handler to it without worrying about like the adding and removing event listeners and stuff. This will just automatically be taken care of by the browser when, like, if the element gets destroyed somehow, rather than having to manually remove these and you know, do that sort of busy work. But now if I save that, and let me go back to get this custom element example here. I will query selector it again. So you can see we still got all our clicks and stuff like that. So you can see it incrementing there for the number of times that I'm calling clicked. So I can even go one step further and say, let counter equal 0. Clicks plus counter times. And now click 2 times, click 3 times, click 4 times, etc., 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 until we run out of numbers. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah. So I noticed that it's when you put the, like next to H1 where you put the custom element example / custom element example, that's where it calls the constructor. And I noticed that the script for what the constructor is actually comes after the calling for it.
Yes, yes. So I mentioned that before where as long as your JavaScript runs at some point and defines that at some point, it's going to do something. Otherwise, the browser will just throw up its hand and say, oh, it looks like a div to me. Literally. It'll treat it like a div. Which is good for like situations. It's like, oh, maybe you do have to run your code in a browser that doesn't support custom elements. It's like, oh, I know someone's going to run Internet Explorer or the super ancient version of Chrome or Safari on their iPhone 3GS that they still have. You know, as long as you're not shipping them JavaScript that would break. So like, you know, you can't use a class obviously, but if you ship them like a version of that code that would run, and you just don't call, or you just don't include any of the custom elements like the registry stuff, or you include a polyfill for that, or even just don't make the script altogether, you can still get some sort of utility out of it. So that's that. That's kind of the basic example of it. So the next step, the next bit is this is where we cover like the life cycles. So life cycles are they're a common concept in programming, and it's literally it's like say that you're, for instance, making an HTTP request, or what's if that's a good, like you're making a network request. So for instance, you want to fetch an HTML file from JavaScript from your clients in order to do something with it. So it's like, okay, I'm going to send a request off, but before I send that request off, I'm going to do this work, and then I'm going to send the request off, and then after that, I'm going to do some other work once I receive the response from that. And so those two bits, those are actually theoretically the basis for lifecycle hooks. So like when you have, like you would call them something like on request, or before.
Bless you.
Thank you. Yeah, you would say like, you would be like, oh, before request, and then you would do something like that. And it's like after response, you know, you would do your other work. And you know, were you to like write your code in a specific way, you can make it so that other people who you don't know and never interact with can write some code that says, okay, run this function before the request, in the before request part of the life cycle, and then run this code in the after request part of the life cycle. But so like it sounds really like ooh, life cycle, like, you know, there's something really kind of fancy going on, but literally it's just when this thing happens, run this code. And like the implementation of it, if you're seeing it, it's fairly simple, because it's literally just, does this function, does this method exist on this object, or was it passed in as part as an argument? Call it, otherwise don't. That's really all there is to it. So you just have to know that like this code is going to run in response to this specific action being taken, and it's not really like super. It's dressed up in this term of life cycle, but it's a fairly simple idea. It's just, you know, when this thing happens, do this other thing. So with that being said, we've got 3 lifecycle hooks here and 1 this observed attributes, which ties into this attribute changed callback here. So there's one other one, which is adopted document change or something like that, which is when your element gets, literally when your element gets adopted by another document. And I've never used that one. I don't actually know what the use case for that would be necessarily, but it's there if you discover one. And there's some resources in the README where you can read more about this stuff. But anyway, the ones I'm going to cover, the ones that I think are necessary to know, is first is the connected callback. So if you'll notice in the connected callback, this is where we're setting the inner text and we're doing the append child. And this is the same as, almost the same code as what we were calling inside this constructor. But there's one difference, and it's the reason why we needed to call it inside the connected callback, which is that we're looking at this previous element sibling. So if I were to write this code inside the constructor, and I'll actually open up before I just show you what it looks like when it's running. Basic. So this is how it looks like when it's running. You see this first one is I'm a custom element, and this one's I'm also a custom element. Excuse me. And it's able to do this also one because down here we're seeing we have this example too, and we're saying, oh yeah, in this example we're going to use the standard DOM API insert a JSON element, and we're going to say after that element's over, after this closing tag here, we want you to append this new element and insert this new element. So it's essentially the same as me saying, okay, I've got this one. I want you to set it up so it's this, is what I'm saying right here. And then I'm doing another one down there where it says, okay, now insert another one. So, and that's literally the order we're in. Notice we only have to define it once in this. We don't have to define it every time you use it. We just have to define it with the custom element registry once, and then from then on we can use it as many times as we'd like. But if I were to have put this code inside of the constructor, then this also would never show up. In fact, I'm going to do that and show you that right now. So I'll do that, and I'll call it, and it's just going to say I'm a custom element. So that's that. But now if I put that back there, and it also changes this other stuff. I'm not sure how that's being changed, but the important thing is that in order to get this stuff to because I have these static ones here, that's why. But if I were to put this inside of the constructor, if I did not have them already defined on the HTML page, since they're already there, it'll work just fine. Because it's already on the page. But for this one, when I call new on it, down here, it's not attached to anything. It's not part of the DOM. They're not part of the document itself. So it doesn't have a previous element sibling, and it won't have one until we insert it after our example element here. So what's happening then is that what's happening is that when this element is added, this code is being called. So if I were to do that, and then I were to use console.log example 2 inner text, it's going to return nothing. Right here, our line 39 there, where we logged our example2.intertext, it's just going to be an empty string because nothing's been done yet. We haven't attached it to the element. We haven't attached it to the DOM. So this connected callback hasn't run. So we haven't said anything. But now after we insert it, then that code will run. And you can see right here, I'm also a custom element how neat. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, enough. So only the constructor is called with the custom element example by H1. The other things have to be called within the script or else.
The constructor will still be called. The constructor will always be called.
Okay.
But the connected callback will only be called when you're added to the DOM, when you're actually considered part of the tree there, when you're represented in that HTML. Because I can create these elements. I could call new on these and have 1 million of these and never attach them to the DOM, and you would never see them in the markup.
Huh.
They would just be kind of hanging around doing their thing until JavaScript decided to get rid of them for whatever reason, or never. So you don't have to technically attach these to the DOM to make them useful, but to have their full capabilities, which is reacting to the elements around it and working with the actual structure of the document, you do need to have it as part of that. So you do need to insert it somehow, whether it's with an append child or it's an insert a JSON element or something like that. I would have called append child right here, except when I was writing this out, I found out that the script tag was being considered part of the it wasn't being skipped. So essentially, it would do custom element example. Put it down here like this, and it would say, oh, the previous one is a script, so it's not a custom element example, so we wouldn't say also. In fact, if I just did that right here, you can see right, I have a custom element how neat, because this one at the bottom here sees the script tag. So the next one is the disconnected callback. So this is called when it's removed. So we see an example of this down here when we say example3.remove. This is again, it's a standard DOM API. I'm not defining this. It doesn't belong to me at all. This is just a way for you to say, okay, I have this element and I want to pull it out. I don't want it to be part of my document anymore. So when that happens, and there are other ways of doing it as well, obviously, but for this example, we'll do it this way, since we already have the reference to example 3. We could also do something like, we could query we could use this document.body, and we could we're going to remove this child from it, or something like that. A bunch of different ways, depending on the context. But anyway, so when I call remove, it's going to call this disconnected callback. So you can see, when I set this code up, I have example 1, 2, 3. I'm actually inserting I have one element defined, and I'm inserting 2 more elements. But then I'm immediately removing this example 3. So if I were to remove this line of code, you can see here's this, I'm a custom element showing back up. But I'll put it back here, and I'll run it again, and you can see, bye friends, because that disconnected callback was being called from this example 3 being taken out of things. So this is in here. So say you have event listeners defined. It's like, okay, you write a method on here. It says on change or something like that. And you say, okay, I want a callback, which is a function that would accept like an old and a new value or something like that. And it says, okay, so whenever, say that the part of this custom element was an input of some kind, in which when we do our live coding later, we're going to be doing a select list. But when we do this on change, we can say, okay, I'm going to do this dot query selector select dot add event listener change, and then we're going to do
A person just joined us. Hey.
Oh, It's Joseph.
Anothe?
Anothe.
Or
Yes, Annotate. That's me.
You were at the.
Welcome.
You were from the in-person ones, weren't you?
I'm sorry?
You were at the in-person meetups, right?
Yes.
Good to see you again.
I know. Same. Likewise.
Welcome back.
Is there?
Yeah.
So we're kind of in the middle of the examples right now, but if you'd like, I can go back and explain some of the earlier stuff if there's anything you're unfamiliar with. We're talking about HTML and JavaScript and the DOM and classes and things of that nature. Are you familiar with all those concepts?
We are actually in this process of learning right now, so I'm just following along.
Okay. We're gonna do some live coding a little bit later, and then after that we'll have a question and answer, like a official question and answer segment. But so
Okay.
if you want to save your questions for then, that's fine. But if there's while I'm talking, if there's anything you'd like me to clarify, just feel free to jump in, and I'll try to do it.
Awesome. Thank you.
So anyway, so we're talking about the say that you have we have a custom elements, and say that as part of this custom element we have a select list. We don't in this example, but we're just writing some code as if we do. Pseudocode is called. So in our on change, we have this where we're going to add a query for our select elements, and then we're going to add a change listener on it. And that change listener will just, whenever there's a change on the select, like you select an option, it'll call this callback here. So the only thing is that when you add an event listener, you have to keep a reference to this exact function, or you can never remove it. And I mean literally this exact function. You can't put in like another function that looks like it later on. It has to be literally the exact same code that you defined here. So what you end up having to do is you end up having to create some way of storing listeners. So let's do const listener equals this, and then we're going to do this dot listeners dot push type change. And we're going to do callback or not call listener, and then we're going to pass in that listener. And then, so we have that there. And then when we get removed, we actually have to go back and we have to do all this manually again. Because of, again, that's the rules. That's how things are set up. It's nothing to do with custom elements. This is just HTML elements. So now we have to do for const type listener of this dot listeners inside of our disconnected callback. This is when we get removed from the DOM. So we're no longer part of anything. We're not going to have our select visible, our hypothetical select visible. So now we can do this dot query selector, query select, and we're going to do remove event listener. And it's going to be our type and listener. So this is going to be true of other patterns as well. This is the event emitter pattern, which is separate from custom elements. If you've ever worked with Angular, you'll see a kind of a similar analog to this with their observables, where you have to subscribe to them, and then later on you have to unsubscribe with your listeners and stuff like that. So, or like you get a return listener that you have to later call in like an on-destroy callback or something like that. So this is just like a common programming concept that's is going to hold for other libraries or even other environments outside of the browser, where it's like if you have something like an event emitter, you generally always have to keep track of that function and what that function is attached to, so that you can later clean it up. It's called doing cleanup work. So that's an example of something you do inside of a disconnected callback. I've got these things that if I don't clean them up, they're just going to create this ever-growing resource kind of sponge that the browser is never able to get rid of, and so it's gradually just going to slow everything down and eventually just completely drive everything kaput. At the worst case, if you use enough resources, you could actually potentially make the whole computer go kaput. But that's a lot harder. Not really going to get into that, but just an example of something you have to do inside the disconnected callback. So I'll get rid of that code. That's connected and disconnected. They're both very tightly related to each other. In the connected callback, you could also define these event listeners if you want to have like some internal listeners that you wanted to make, where it's like, okay, I want to keep track of the events myself, and then I'll expose a different method that returns the values somehow, where it's like, oh, I want to return a list of all the values that have ever been done, where maybe you have some more machinery behind the scenes that you're calling into, like if you're using Redux, for instance, like a state machine, you could integrate that where, okay, I'm going to add my state machine's event listener, or I'm going to add this event listener that's adds data to a state machine inside connected callback, and remove the listener in disconnected callback, and then I'm going to have some other function that actually returns like whatever subsection or the entirety of that data from the state machine. If you don't know what a state machine is, it's the basis for all video games. So just picture a video game, and that's a state machine. So from there, the last part of the lifecycle bit is the attribute change callback. So this is like exactly what it says on the tin. So an attribute is, for instance, if I'm on this H1 and I say ID equals title, that ID bit right here is an attribute. In this case, it's a built-in attribute. And its value is whatever I've assigned it to on the equal sign. So in this case, it's title. That's not the only, I don't have to rely on built-in attributes, even for like standard HTML. I can also do foo equals title or foo equals bar or whatever I want. Excuse me, I have to sneeze in. Okay, never mind. You can put in any values you want into this, as long as they're able to be represented as a string. So when I've got my custom element examples here, so down here, I'm going to set attribute on here to be foo. And when I set that attribute, you can see it calls this attribute change callback, and it'll log undefined. And that's because I'm setting up this example here because this attribute is not the same as any properties I define in my class. So if I want to define a foo property and I want to populate it with whatever comes from this attribute change, in that case I have to do this dot foo equals new value. And then I'll be able to actually work with these values that come in through properties that I define myself. But otherwise, I have to go through the DOM methods in order to access them. But so down here, I'll set attribute foo, and I'll log, okay, your new value, your old value was null because it wasn't there, it wasn't defined on it before. But your new value is foo because that's what you set the attribute to. And then right here, I'm going to call remove attribute, and it'll call that callback again. And again, still foo is still undefined because I haven't set it to anything myself, so it's not going to do anything. The browser's not going to set it for me. You say, okay, you change your foo attribute again. The old value was foo, which you set it to, and then you removed it, so the new value is null. But then note that I'm setting and removing the bar attribute here, but it's not being called. And that's because of this static get thing here called the observed attributes. This is your way of giving the browser a clue as to what you want to have call your attribute change callback. Because otherwise, the number of attributes are effectively infinite. So, and you can call them infinite number of times. Let's say this attribute change callback, you do some really expensive work in it, you take a select list, for example, and we're going to be doing this later, but where you're going to populate it with all the options from the lists that you passed in through an attribute. that can potentially be very expensive, especially if you have like thousands of items in this list. Well, if you're calling this attribute change callback every single time that happens, and especially if you're not filtering out based on events, then it's gonna really slow down your code a lot. So you have this kind of mandatory thing where you say, okay, I want to do the observed attributes and I want it to be foo. So we'll show you what happens if you don't define that, which is nothing. If you don't define your observed attributes, this attribute change callback will never run. It's as if it never exists. Until you tell the browser what you want to actually keep track of, the browser will let you keep track of nothing. And that's essentially lexical links. So is that clear so far? All right. So the final example. This is the advanced example, and I'm not. There are parts of this that are so in the README. And I'll pop that up again. I mentioned that they are part of the larger web component specification. So that includes, I think it's 2 other major, I'll call them major features, which is something called the shadow DOM and something called like the HTML template and the slot element. So those have their own uses that can tie into custom elements. And in this advanced example, we're actually going to be using the shadow DOM because that's the code that I pulled over was using that. So that's just an example of what that looks like.
Just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, the shadow realm.
Shadow DOM.
Shadow DOM. Okay. That's why I made sure to check.
The shadow DOM is a DOM that technically exists, but is really hard to work with if you're not directly in control of it.
All right. Thank you.
So that's a newer feature. I have not used this. But it's in the example, and I'll stop over very quickly over that. What it's doing is because we have this content editable article, we have a word count custom elements that looks at the parent node of it. And then we've got this little count words function in here that, which we could also define as a method, I believe, but in fact, I'm going to do that right now. And I'll do this dot count words. And then this will actually, so we're gonna pull the words out of it based on, we're gonna split all these words up by white space. Not the world's greatest way of detecting words, but it works well enough for most purposes. And then we're going to attach a shadow root, which is the shadow DOM part. And inside of that is where we're going to be putting our text. And the reason why we're doing that is because when we put the text inside of it, it doesn't get detected by our own word count code here. So if this were just generally added, it would create an improper count because it would say, okay, we also counting the words and then the count itself. So it would be like +2 when it shouldn't be. So we're going to, so I'll run this code here. So because this is using the content editable attribute, I can actually go in here and start typing. So, this isn't updating from this time for some reason. Probably because I changed it from. I know why. This can't be that there. Text. So it's keeping track of the words and it's updating them for you. So And how that's working is every 200 milliseconds, it's just looking at the text again and rerunning that calculation, which is not a very efficient way of doing it, by the way. I would probably set up some sort of event listener and do it that way rather than doing this thing where it's like you literally have this running no matter what anyone is doing. This code is always running.
Yeah, you should only run when people are interacting with specifically that word editor.
Yeah, but for like an example of running a setting up like, oh, this is how you do a word count, like a simple word count counter. This works for an example. But so that's how you do it with something more with using a more advanced feature like the shadow root, so that you can have it as part of this word count as part of like a larger element. And then still be able to work with it. So, all right, that's all of our examples. We're going to move on to the live coding bit. We're at, I think we try to keep these from 6 to 8. I'm seeing about half an hour left. We might end up running a bit long. So if y'all need to leave by 8 and we're not done by then, just feel free to dip out. We're not going to be upset or anything like that. So we'll hold it against you. But if we need to run long, we'll keep going until we get through all the material. But try to finish by 8 as best as we can. So time for the live coding. So as I mentioned, we're going to be making a select list, a custom select list. The reason why I did this one is because that's generally like one of the first things you reach for with a library is how do I repeat data within an element? And before custom elements, it was really just kind of clunky how you would do it. You would have to keep track of all the different ways that your code could ever change. And really have to be very careful about like, okay, so I'm gonna only call it the specific way. And make sure that my code 6 years in the past that I wrote isn't going to break as a result, and such and such things like that nature. The things that like with AngularJS, for instance, you get ng repeat and you're like, oh, phew, thank you, right? And you don't have to define any logic aside from pulling in the data. So with custom elements, you don't get something that convenient like ng repeat. But what you do get is through the power of lifecycles, you get the ability to write some very succinct code that is, from your essentially bulletproof in a way. In that, as long as the data is being passed into this attribute, it's trivial for you to repeat elements or to run like the equivalent of a repeater in order to get your select list populated with its options or any other sort of function you do, like, oh, I want to display a table with all these rows in it and stuff like that. In fact, if you are familiar with JSX, which is, again, a feature from React, behind the scenes, you can actually set it up where it's like you're calling the exact same code, you're just using like this simple function, and then you're able to write like what looks like HTML inside of your JavaScript. But that's an aside. I won't get into that much more. But other than to point out that that's kind of what you're doing with React is you're calling document.create elements in these render functions and stuff. Ultimately. So all right, get started. First thing that we need is we need to actually have an actual HTML document. So we're going to do that now. I'm going to set up this. I'm going to use this Emmet abbreviation, which is built in my editor. And ta-da! If that looks familiar to you, it's because it's the same structure that I used right here. So literally, I just typed HTML5 there, and I expanded out, and then I added my own code here. So this is actually the only code I wrote. I didn't write any of this other stuff. So all right, we're inside of our index.html now. So we're going to. I'll put another H1 here. Select list example.
Bless you.
Ha. I'll close my. She said thank you in case you couldn't hear. I'm closing the door for you. That was my fiance sneezing in the other room. So I got my select list example H1 here. So obviously, go go and CD inside there, then open up the open that up, and yep, select this example. Hey, what do you know? So now, next, I'm going to include my script index.js, which is right here. No, actually, a little thing there. I'll just make sure that it's being included. Yep, there we go. Console.log fired. So, okay. Now let's get started with our custom element. So anyone have an idea for what we should call this? Chime in with a name. Anyone good with names? This is one of the 3 hardest problems in computer science.
What are we going to be doing with this?
It's a select list, custom select list. This will actually be the container for the select list.
So list container?
Sure. Does anyone know the 3? Actually, it's the 4 hardest rules in programming, or 4 hardest things in programming. It's naming, cation, validation, and off by 1 errors. That's the 4 hardest things. Little nerd joke for you. So we got our class in, list container, and as I said before, we have to extend the HTML element, and then we'll go down here and we will we'll define it with our registry. And you want to do list dash container, Benjamin? You think that's good?
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm.
Oh, no worries, no worries. So I'm going to not write the HTML for now. I'm just going to keep this all in JavaScript just so you can see what all the DOM APIs look like. I will note that for a lot of people, it's considered best practice to use as little JavaScript as possible. And the reason why is because of a concept called progressive enhancement. And that's where, say that your user can't use JavaScript or has it disabled or something like that, or just isn't able to get your JavaScript, like it's being stripped by the network for whatever reason. If your code, like your markup is still there, the browser can still do something with it, and you can still define like default fallback behavior, graceful degradation, a term you might hear, where even though your JavaScript isn't running, there's still like some sort of useful data being presented, even if it's not the full picture that you wanted to display or would need JavaScript to display. So that's just, so that's considered the best practice for it. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to keep everything in JavaScript just to be able to show off all of the different functions and things. So all right, we got our list container now. Let's make a new instance now. So const list container equals new list container. Woohoo! And we're going to document.body.append child. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Bless you.
Thank you. My nose is itchy. I wonder if some sort of pollen's getting in here somehow. So apologies if you see me itching my nose a lot, but that's why. Anyway, so we got our list container. We got we're appending it to the document, and then so nothing's happening with it so far because we haven't defined anything. But if we look at our HTML, you can see right below our script tag is our list container. Yay! So now let's do something interesting with it. We want to, first of all, we need to create a select list, right? That's what we're keeping track of all this. So let's go to our constructor. Actually, not even our constructor. We're gonna. You can do this with classes with newer versions of JavaScript, which I think pretty much these versions of JavaScript are available in the dominant number of browsers. But for like versions from when classes came out, this wasn't available, and that's, you can say that select equals document.create element select. What you used to have to be able to do is you have to go in here and you would have to write this dot select equals document create element and such and such and such. This is actually a feature that came over from TypeScript, if you're familiar with that at all, which is just it's a language for compiling the JavaScript. They introduced this way back as kind of like a quality of life feature for themselves. And then the JavaScript committee went, hey, we like that. We're going to do that too. And then here we are. So, but anyway, so for our purposes, we're going to assign this .select to the document.create element select, just like that. And then we're also going to create or assign a list. And that list is going to, eventually that's going to contain all of our data. So anyone have an idea of what we should do next? There are no wrong answers except for the wrong answers.
Does anyone speak other than me? I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's fine if you're just the only one speaking, Bender, I think. I'm just trying to basically like seeing if trying to make it a little more interactive, where it's like, okay, we can.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm still not that familiarized with
Oh,
this.
it's fine. It's fine.
I'm just following through.
You're already talking enough to be.
Yeah,
we're happy to have people like you.
Just offer. That's all. So, all right. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to append the select list. So if we look inside, we still don't have it there, right? But if I were to do documents.query selector list container .select, there's our select list. But it's not part of the document yet, so it's just hanging out there in the wild, right? So you can do this in the constructor if you want. I'm going to do it in the lifecycle hook just for demonstration purposes. Do this dot append child, this dot select. And then for completion's sake, inside the disconnected callback, this dot select dot. So when we add it to the document, we're also going to add our select list in there. When we get removed from the document, we're going to pull the select list right back out. Maybe don't necessarily need to do that, but again, for demonstration purposes. So all right, we got our connected callback, we got our disconnected callback, we're adding and removing it. So now if we refresh the page, we can see our select list there. But we're missing some stuff from it. Namely, we're missing our options, right? And potentially some other stuff like the ID or whatever, but we'll just worry about the options for now. So we got our list defined here. I'm going to write this static get observed attributes. And I'm going to observe data list. So the reason why I'm doing data list is because there's an actual built-in property on elements called dataset. So if I do list container dot dataset, after I'll set the data list attribute. I'll do a simple array here. And then I do console.log list container.dataset. It should include all of those, include that list that I have there. So if I refresh, there you see right there, there's the non-string map where it says list, and then the stringified version of that, right? So what that allows me to do is, so I've got my attribute change callback. Make sure I get the right name there. And since I'm only observing the one attribute, I can skip any sort of checks. I can skip even looking at the attributes that get passed in. I can just go this.list equals this.datasets.lists, and I need to parse it because I had this this array right here from before, and I had turned that into a string because in order to set it as an attribute, it has to be a string. It can't be like just a regular element, because if you're to look at the actual elements, you can see that right here, it's actually on the element itself. So you can look at there and you can say, okay, here's my data set, here's my data list. So I'm going to do this.list equals JSON.parse this.dataset.list, and then I'm going to console.log this.list. And you'll notice that, so I got my 2 lines here, right? List content.set attributes, and then immediately after that, I'm calling console.log on this list container.dataset in order to look at it from the dataset perspective. But in between those two, that's when my attribute change callback ran. So that's an example of the lifecycle hook in action, is that I didn't have to think about assigning that list. I didn't have to worry about the timing of it. Like, oh, okay, I've set this attribute, and now I gotta like wait a certain amount of time, or I gotta, respond to a different event or anything like that. It just happens where this code will run, and then by the time I reach my very next line of code, everything's always already set up the way I want it to. So I don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to set my data set there, and it's going to be JSON.stringify food. And then, so what's the next thing after that? So we got our select list, we got appended, we've got our data list attribute being pulled in and stuff like that. What do you think does anyone have an idea what the next step is? You're correct. It's appending the items from the list as options.
Sorry about the silence.
No worries. I'm just I'm not even being started. So I'm going to do response item of this.list. And it's going to be this.select.append child. And the option equals document.create elements option. Select.append child option. Right, and then for here, we need to do option dot set attribute or value item, and then option dot inner text also equals item. So we're gonna have a select list with one item. That item's gonna be just a string food, and then when we select it, it's gonna be the value string food. All right. So refresh, and there you go. There's our item right there. So, okay, that's all well and good, but how do we know what is currently selected, what our current value is? Our data could look that way, but or our label could look that way, but maybe instead of it being like a string for food, maybe it's actually like we're going to set the value to be the index of it, right? So this dot list dot index of item. String. And then now, if we look at it, our value is going to be 0 for that first option. So we can do it that way as well. So let's keep track of that then. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do exactly what I mentioned before, which was having our listeners. So this.select.add event listener change. Define our listener as being it'll take an event, that's what the E stands for, and then let's do we'll make a span to hold it. And we'll do this dot span dot inner text equals current value e dot target dot value. We'll pass that in there, and we'll also make sure to add it to our little listeners array. push. And then in our disconnected callback, we're going to do this dot select dot remove event listener as we're actually doing the loop. Listener of this dot listeners. So, all right, now let's see what the problem is here. Because we don't have this, or wait, we do have the span there. Let's see why it's not updating. Oh, you know what I'll do is I'll do food and then bar, and I'll make sure it's not an issue with the fact that there's only one element. There we go. All right, so then so that's how we'll keep track of that value here, and I'll throw in a little new line in here so that when we actually select that, it'll just pop up there below. And we can even do it that way as well. There we go. So okay, we got our bar, and we got our bar with a where we got our select list, and then we've got a little value tracker as part of it that will say which element, what the value, currently selected value is. So in addition to what the label is, it also includes some visual feedback of what the actual selected value is considered. So okay, we've done all that. Now that's the basics for implementing a select list. There's some more we can do with this. There's a lot more we can do with this actually. Since I have 11 minutes left, I think this would be probably a good enough stopping point as far as required knowledge, I guess. But we can also get into things like, okay, how do we manage? So, like for instance, if I go back over here now and I set this data list to be foobar baz, you would expect that there would only be 3 options, right? Well, it turns out that we're actually going to have 5 options.
Foo and bar come up twice. Yep.
Because we never removed the old options. So that's one thing we can do here is that, so we can actually add while this dot select dot first element child is null, or is not null, which means that while this select list has children, we're going to remove all those children. And this is kind of a brute force way of doing it. We could also come up with some sort of like logic for, all right, we're going to loop here if we're going to look to see that we have an option that already exists, and if it's there, we're going to leave it. Otherwise, we're going to add it in there in between, stuff like that. That would create a lot of code, and I think it would be kind of distracting. So I'll just do it the quick and dirty way. We're just going to get rid of all the elements, all of the options in there, and then we're going to run our loop to add all of the items back into the list.
So it only adds the last one then.
Yeah,
basically.
So now we have foobar baz, exactly like you expect. And then if I flip these around,
Foo and bar.
foo and bar, just like that. So one thing that I will do is I'm going to, because we're not getting any sort of feedback until we actually physically select it, which is not so good if we have like a 0 element kind of situation. So we could append a placeholder element. So we'll do const placeholder document dot create element option. Placeholder dot set attribute placeholder true. Placeholder dot under text equals one. And then we'll append that. That won't have a value. But what it will do is, for the situation where we only have one element, now we can actually select it. But if we don't have a placeholder, if we just want to select an element right away, then we can drop this and we can add here select dot.
Before you refresh, is the placeholder now gone as the option in the list example?
Yes.
Okay.
Option dot selected, and we do option dot value triple equals 0. So we can see it's selected, but it's not. Well, actually, but it's not firing or anything like that. So we'll have to write code so just dot select dot and just dot value equals 0, for instance, and then that would select it. So we'd have to go through that whole loop to try to get that started, or we can just do the placeholder route where we don't have to worry about that. We can just force them to actually make a selection and then.
All right.
And then there's that. So that's and if you'll notice that we're calling the set attribute 3 times, and every time we're calling it, we are running this attribute change callback. So we actually ran it 3 times, and to prove that, I will just console.log this.list. And we'll refresh, and we'll see here's 3 logs with each of our subsequent values that we did. So if I take out any of these, let's take out this last one, for instance, we're only calling it twice. And if I take out this one, obviously we're only calling it once. But say that I was doing this in a loop. This is really dangerous, what I'm doing right here. This is what's known as creating an infinite loop. I'm going to set this.
Oh boy.
Huh? Oh boy, yes, indeed. I might in fact break my computer.
Well, true. I've seen that statement before.
Oh man, it's good for one thing and one thing alone: generators and when you want to hurt yourself. And then look at that. See, it's just constantly running. Right?
We have to.
I've got to close this before I destroy my computer. Yep.
I can't remember. I remember like one time I saw that in like a working code. They had a break statement inside the while loop. I'm like, there's a much better way to do this, sir. There's a much better way to do this. Yeah,
generally, I've had to use while loops myself, while true loops, especially. I very rarely do. Should you actually use a while true? But it does have its uses. The biggest one is in this is a different feature in JavaScript called generators. To write a generator, you do function like that. You put a little asterisk there, and then we'll do foo, and then while true, we'll do yield ++ counter. So that counter equals 0, and then yield counter, and then we can do, let's say, if counter greater than 4, break. And then we'll do, and this is just for bonus points here. We'll create our generator, and then we'll do f.next to, so that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this will be the last one. So if I go, so let's reopen that there. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then if I call it one more time, value is undefined and done is true. And I can actually keep calling f.next over and over and over again until the end of time from another while true if I wanted. And it would always return undefined and true. That's generators. That's not necessary for this. That's just an example of how while true can be useful. So, all right, and that's 4 minutes left. Managed to squeeze it in there. I got the one issue here that I'll probably end up fixing where current value gets set to this. I'll have to see about placeholder dot.
The fact that placeholder doesn't disappear. So once you decide foobar and baz, it's still an option amongst them.
Pure value is null. That's better. So, all right. Or even I could set this. I should set this to empty string. Foo, and then there you go. All right. So, and that is essentially the custom elements demonstration, custom elements presentation. Any questions? Any clarification, design?
I think I pretty much missed the beginning of it, but would this be on the Code Stack YouTube?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah. So you can. I'll actually after the questions, I'll point out the resource. I'll upload this code right now to the repo, and then while we're doing Q&A, and then after Q&A, I'll post the links to the YouTube channel, and then also to the GitHub repo where you can look over the code yourself and play with it yourself.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Make sure I pronounce your name correctly. Anote.
Yes.
Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay, that's fine. So I'll just put a big fan in there. So yeah, open forum for questions from anyone. Any clarification is necessary. Joseph, I know you got in a little bit late too. Benjamin, I think you were following along for the most part, but if you have anything you're curious about as well, it doesn't necessarily strictly have to be about custom elements either. If there was just some generic feature of JavaScript or HTML or anything that you're curious about programming that you want to know about, you can ask about that as well too. But so I'm going to switch this code over here, and then if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.
Not a question, but I just want to apologize for coming in late. I'm still kind of learning as well, and so I kind of wanted to just jump in and try to absorb as much as I could. So
yeah, you feel like it was generally helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to follow along as best as I could. So yeah, thank you.
It's a bit hard when it's a coding language you're not proficient in sometimes.
Yeah.
I was having some troubles myself. Don't worry.
Yeah, and that's part of why I included like this concepts part, is so that stuff that's it doesn't really go into a lot of detail. In fact, you could perhaps say this is a criminally tiny amount of detail to go into, but as opposed to getting sidetracked into a 4-hour demonstration or 4-hour explanation of what is HTML. Nobody really wants that. So instead of just keep it short and simple. But if there's anything from that, it's like, I want to know more. That would be the time to ask too.
I think I'm mostly good.
Cool.
Trying to think if there's a precise question.
I'm going into GitHub right now, so you get to see the.
Are we supposed to be recording? It is past 8, and it.
Yeah, I'm going to continue recording until I get this uploaded. Oh, it's actually 18.
Okay. Just want to make sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm partially keeping this recorded because that allows chances for like questions to come up. It seems like everyone's pretty clear on things, so I might cut it off here. You're right. So if everyone's fine, if nobody has any questions, obviously you can see the URL here, github.com/codestacksj/codestack_meetup. So we've got our first 17 presentations there, and then the 18th, obviously I'm adding now. And then as far as you can also see the link, be able to link to the playlist here. And I'll show that here. That's youtube.com/playlist/list/ a whole bunch of stuff that I cannot say with being useful to anyone. So if you need a link to that, I'll post that into the chat. But otherwise, if you go to the GitHub, we have a link to the YouTube playlist in the README there. And I just posted a link to the repo as well. So if everyone's feeling good, yeah, thanks for coming, Joseph. Really appreciate it. We always happy when anyone comes by. Always happy to share your knowledge. So it's fine if you show up late, anything like that. We're not picky about that sort of thing. So feel free to come by whenever you can. And as long as you can get something out of it, that's what's important to us.
All right, I'm going to head out also, and it's nice seeing you again, Zach and Mark. Well, I can't see Mark, but yeah.
He tried to get his camera going, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks again, Anthony. I'll see you again in a future one.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Take it easy right now too. I'll see you all later. We'll have this posted as soon as possible on the GitHub channel. I'll get it cut up tonight, and then I'll submit the request. But it usually takes a little while because we have to send it over to a different team to get that uploaded. They're the ones in charge of the YouTube channel. So as soon as that gets put up, you'll be able to see it there. That should be made hopefully by next week, sometime at the latest. But
okay.
there you go.
All righty.
Thanks again, everybody.